Daniel Whitmore thought he understood the shape of his own marriage. He didn't know that the woman he'd loved for 11 years had already priced his life down to the last decimal. And within the hour, in the marble lobby of a downtown law firm, he would hear exactly what she believed he was worth. Before we go any further, if stories about quiet dignity, meeting loud arrogance, move you the way they move me, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because we tell these stories every week. And I'm curious where you're watching from today, so drop your city in the comments. Now, let me take you back to a Tuesday morning that started like any other, and ended like nothing ever would again. Daniel was 42 years old, and to anyone who passed him on the street, he looked like a man who had settled comfortably into the middle of his life. He wore plain gray suits that fit but never impressed. He drove a 9-year-old sedan with a small dent on the rear bumper he had never bothered to fix. He carried a battered leather satchel to work each morning and returned with it each evening. And, in between, he did something his wife had long ago stopped asking about, because she assumed she already knew the answer. She assumed he was a mid-level financial analyst at a firm whose name she could never quite remember. She assumed he made a decent, unremarkable salary. She assumed, above all, that she had married a safe man. And safe men, in Vanessa's private vocabulary, were men who could be managed. Vanessa Whitmore was 38, and she had spent the last 3 years slowly, deliberately preparing to leave. Daniel did not know this. He knew only that something in the house had gone cold, that the conversations had shortened, that the woman who once curled against him on the couch now sat at the far end of it scrolling through her phone with a small private smile. He had told himself it was a phase. He had told himself that every long marriage passed through winters. He was, in this one thing, wrong, and he was about to learn how wrong in the cruelest possible way. What Vanessa never understood in 11 years of marriage was the satchel. She thought it was sentimental clutter, an old bag her husband was too dull to replace. She had never once looked inside it with real curiosity. If she had, she might have found the folded quarterly statements he brought home to review. At night, she might have noticed the letterhead. She might have understood that the firm she could never remember the name of was the firm her husband had founded at 29, built from a single leased desk into one of the most quietly powerful private investment houses in the region, a firm that managed assets for people whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. Daniel had made a choice, early in the marriage, that he now understood had been a mistake. He had chosen to keep his success invisible, not out of shame, but out of a wound. His own father had been a wealthy man who wore his wealth like armor, who measured every relationship by what it could extract, who died surrounded by people who wanted things and no one who loved him. Daniel had watched that funeral from the front pew and promised himself he would be loved for who he was, not for what he had. So he dressed plainly, he drove modestly, he let the world, and eventually his wife, believe he was ordinary. He wanted to be chosen for the man, not the money. For a while it had worked. Vanessa had married him when the firm was young and the money was not yet visible even to Daniel himself. She had, he believed, married him for love. But somewhere along the way, the woman he married had begun to resent the very ordinariness he had constructed. She wanted more, and she believed her husband could not give it, and she had decided to find it elsewhere. His disguise had been so complete that it had cost him the thing it was meant to protect. The Tuesday it all came apart began with a text message. Daniel had left for the office at 7, as always, and returned home at 10 because he had forgotten a set of documents in his home study, documents concerning a fund that would close that afternoon. He let himself in quietly. And on the kitchen counter, face up, lit and unlocked, was Vanessa's phone. He did not intend to read it, but his eyes fell on it the way anyone's eyes fall on a lit screen, and what he saw stopped him where he stood. The message was from a contact saved as R. It read, "In full, papers are ready. Meeting at Harlan and Crest at 11:30. Bring the marriage certificate and the deed. He won't know what hit him. See you soon, my love. Daniel read it 3 times. He felt something in his chest that was not quite pain and not quite anger, but a strange, cold clarity, as if a window had been thrown open. In a stuffy room, Harlan and Crest. He knew the firm. Of course, he knew the firm. In his world, you knew every firm. It was a divorce practice that specialized in aggressive, high-net-worth separations, the kind of practice you hired when you wanted, not just to leave someone, but to leave them ruined. He did not confront her. That was the first thing that separated Daniel Whitmore from most men. He did not shout, did not smash the phone, did not wait by the door for her to come home so he could demand answers. He set the phone back exactly as he had found it. Angled precisely as it had been, he collected his documents from the study. And then he sat down at the kitchen table for a full 10 minutes and simply thought. He thought about the deed she had been told to bring, the deed to the house they had bought together, the house that in fact he had purchased outright before the marriage and moved her into. He thought about the marriage certificate. He thought about the word ruined. And he thought about a man named R who called his wife my love, and who believed, with total confidence, that Daniel would not know what hit him. The arrogance of that phrase settled into him. He won't know what hit him. It was the sentence of someone who had studied him and concluded he was a small man. And in that moment, Daniel made a decision. He would go to Harlan and Crest at 11:30, not to plead, not to fight. Rad. He would simply be there in that lobby when the papers were handed across the table. He would let his wife look him in the eye and tell him to his face what she had planned in whispers. He called his office from the car and asked his assistant to reschedule 2 meetings. Then he called one other number, a name in his phone. He had not dialed in 8 months, a man named Arthur Beale, senior partner at the firm that had handled Daniel's affairs for a decade. A lawyer so discreet and so formidable that most people never knew he existed until it was already too late for them. Daniel told Arthur where he was going and why. Arthur listened without interruption. Then he said only, "Do nothing rash. Say nothing, bring nothing. Let me meet you there." And Daniel, who trusted very few people in the world, trusted Arthur. The offices of Harlan and Crest occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel small the moment they walked in. The lobby was all cold marble and recessed lighting, a fountain trickling somewhere out of sight, the air conditioned to a temperature that suggested importance. Daniel arrived at 11:20. He wore his plain gray suit. He carried his battered satchel. He looked to the receptionist, who glanced up at him like a man who had wandered in to fix the copier. He did not announce himself. Instead, he sat in a low leather chair in the corner of the lobby, half hidden by a column and a broad-leafed plant. And he waited. He had learned patience in boardrooms, where fortunes turned on. Who spoke last? He knew how to be still. At 11:28, Vanessa walked in. She looked beautiful, and she looked triumphant, and those 2 things together made Daniel's chest tighten in a way he had not expected. She wore a dress he had never seen, and beside her, one hand resting on the small of her back with easy possession, walked a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit. Daniel understood. Not a lawyer, a boyfriend. A man with a gym-tanned confidence and a watch that cost more than most people's cars. They did not see Daniel. They walked straight past his column, close enough that he caught the scent of her perfume, and they went to the reception desk, where a young associate in glasses was waiting to escort them up. But they did not go up immediately. There was a delay. The associate murmured something about the conference room, not yet being ready, offered them the small seating area near the elevators, just around the corner from where Daniel sat. And so, Vanessa and her companion settled into chairs perhaps 15 feet from Daniel Whitmore, separated only by the column and the potted plant, and they began to talk. And Daniel, sitting perfectly still, heard every word. The associate had gone to fetch the lead attorney, a woman named Miss Prentice, and while they waited, Vanessa's voice, carried low but clear, sharpened by the confidence of someone who believed she was among allies. "He's going to be so confused," she said, and Daniel heard her laugh. "You have no idea, Richard. Daniel is the most passive man alive. Do you know what he does when something upsets him? Nothing. He just goes quiet and folds his little hands. 11 years I've watched him fold his little hands." Richard said something Daniel couldn't make out, and Vanessa answered, "He makes, what, 90,000 a year? Something like that. He's an analyst. He crunches numbers for men who actually made something of themselves, and he thinks that makes him useful." She laughed again. "The point is, he has no idea what he's worth, and more importantly, he has no idea what I'm about to take." Then Miss Prentice arrived, brisk and expensive, and the conversation shifted into a register Daniel would remember for the rest of his life, because now Vanessa was speaking not to a lover, but to her lawyer, and there was a difference. Now she was building a case. "Let's go over it one more time before we sit down," Miss Prentice said, taking the chair across from them. "I want to make sure we're aligned on the narrative." "The narrative." Daniel closed his eyes. "He's emotionally absent," Vanessa said, and her voice had changed, taken on a rehearsed smoothness. "I've been carrying this marriage alone for years. He's cold. He's withdrawn. There were times I feared for my own safety. Not that he ever touched me, but the tension, the way he'd go silent, it was a kind of cruelty. Emotional abuse. My therapist will say so if we need her. You have the therapist willing to characterize it that way," Ms. Prentice said. "She'll say what I need her to say," Vanessa answered. And Daniel, sitting behind the column, felt each of these words land not as pain, but as evidence. He was not weeping. He was, without moving a muscle, taking notes. "The house is the big one," Vanessa went on. "It's worth about 1.4 million. I want it. I redecorated it. I made it a home, and honestly, he's never home. Anyway, he can find an apartment. And the accounts, I want a full accounting of everything. He hides money, I know he does. He's cheap in these strange ways, and men who are cheap are always hiding something. I want you to find whatever he's hiding, and I want half of all of it, plus support, because I gave up my own career for this marriage. And that last claim, more than any of the others, was the one that broke something open in Daniel. Because it was not true, and Vanessa knew it was not true, and she was saying it anyway with her hand in her lover's hand. She had not given up a career. She had left a job she disliked 8 years ago because she had wanted to, because Daniel had gently told her she never needed to work another day if she didn't want to. And she had taken that gift, and now she was going to weaponize it, dressing her own choice up as a sacrifice she'd made for a cruel man. Miss S. Prentice made a note. "There's the question of his knowledge of the accounts. If he's hiding assets, we'll subpoena. But you said his income is modest. His income is nothing," Vanessa said, with a dismissiveness that was almost cheerful. "That's the beauty of it. He'll be so overwhelmed just trying to keep his little apartment that he'll sign whatever we put in front of him. He won't even hire a real lawyer. Daniel doesn't fight. That's the entire foundation of this. Does not fight. She won't know what hit her," Richard said, and both of them laughed, echoing the message Daniel had read that morning, the words simply reassigned. And Daniel understood then that these two people had a script, and in that script he was a prop, a soft and stupid obstacle to be swept from the board. It was at that exact moment that a second man walked into the lobby of Harlan and Crest. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, in a suit that cost more than everything Vanessa and Richard were wearing combined, but that announced nothing, because true expense never announces itself. He walked with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once in his adult life been asked to wait for anything. He crossed the marble floor, and he did not go to reception. He went to the corner, to the column, and he sat down in the chair beside Daniel Whitmore and said in a voice pitched only for the two of them, "I heard the last part of that. I'm sorry, Daniel. "It's fine, Arthur," Daniel murmured. "It's actually clarifying." Arthur Beale studied his client's face for a moment. "Do you want to leave? We can do all of this without you ever seeing her again." Daniel was quiet. Then he said, "No, I want to give her the papers myself." Arthur raised an eyebrow, the closest that man ever came to surprise. "Which papers?" And here is where the story turns. So stay with me, because everything before this moment was Vanessa building her trap, and everything after it is that trap closing on the person who said it. Daniel reached into his battered leather satchel, the satchel his wife had mocked for 11 years, and he took out a slim manila envelope. He had prepared it quietly in the hour between reading her phone and driving downtown. Inside were not divorce papers. Inside were copies of documents Vanessa had never in her life imagined existed. Let me explain what those documents were, because the plausibility of everything that follows depends on it. When Daniel married Vanessa, on the advice of that same silver-haired lawyer, beside him he had signed a prenuptial agreement. Vanessa had signed it too. She had signed it 11 years ago in a lawyer's office, glancing at it for perhaps 90 seconds, laughing that it hardly mattered because Daniel was just an analyst with no money to protect. She had signed away, in her boredom and her contempt, any claim to the assets Daniel held before the marriage, and any assets generated by the business he owned before the marriage. She had forgotten it entirely. She had built her entire narrative, her house, her half of everything, her support, on a foundation that a single document had erased before she ever met her lover, and the house she wanted so badly, the $1.4 million house she had redecorated and called her home. Daniel had purchased that house outright, in cash, from the firm's earnings, 3 months before the wedding. It was titled in his name alone, listed in the prenuptial agreement by address as separate property, and Vanessa had never contributed a single dollar to it. The deed she had been instructed to bring to this meeting, the deed Richard had told her to fetch, would prove the opposite of what she thought it proved. It would prove she owned nothing of it. But it was the third document in the envelope that made Arthur Beale, that unflappable man, allow himself a slow, small nod of approval. It was a single sheet, freshly printed, a summary statement of Daniel Whitmore's holdings, prepared and certified that morning at Daniel's request. It listed the firm he founded, its assets under management, and his personal net worth, a figure with 8 digits before the decimal point. It was the plain document of a plain man who had spent 11 years letting the woman he loved believe he made $90,000 a year. The associate returned. The conference room was ready. Prentice rose, and Vanessa rose, radiant, and Richard rose, and the three of them turned toward the elevators. And it was then that Daniel Whitmore stood up from behind the column into her line of sight and said one word, "Vanessa." She turned, and I want you to understand what happened to her face, because it happened in stages, the way a building comes down. First, there was blank incomprehension, because her husband was not supposed to be here, was not supposed to be anywhere she had planned. Then there was a flicker of fear, quickly buried, because she believed she still held every card. And then there was the recovery, the tightening into contempt, because Vanessa Whitmore had spent 11 years being certain of exactly one thing, that her husband would never, under any circumstances, fight. "Daniel," she said, and her voice climbed into brightness. "What are you doing here? Are you following me?" "This is my lawyer's office. You need to leave." "I know it's your lawyer's office," Daniel said. His voice was calm. It was maddeningly calm. "I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. I heard everything." Something crossed her face then, but she was a proud woman, and proud people double down. "Then you heard the truth," she said, lifting her chin. "You heard how I really feel. I was going to serve you next week, but fine, we can do it now, since you're here. I want a divorce, Daniel, and I want the house, and I want what I'm owed for 11 years I'll never get back." Richard stepped forward, drawing himself up, playing the role of the protective man. She said her piece. I think you should respect that and leave, buddy. And Daniel looked at Richard for a long moment. This man who had told his wife she wouldn't know what hit her. And he said mildly, "You must be R." And then he turned back to Vanessa and he said, "You told your lawyer I make $90,000 a year." "Because you do," Vanessa snapped. "I'd like you to meet someone," Daniel said. "This is Arthur Beale. He's my attorney." "He has been my attorney for 11 years. Ms. Prentice, the divorce lawyer, who until this second had been standing with professional detachment, went very still because Miss Prentice knew exactly who Arthur Beale was. Every serious lawyer in that city knew who Arthur Beale was, and a man like Arthur Beale did not appear in a lobby to represent an analyst who made $90,000 a year. "Prentice," Arthur said pleasantly, "might I suggest that, before your client says anything further, you and I have a brief conversation. There are some documents your client should have reviewed before scheduling this meeting." "What documents?" Vanessa said, and for the first time the brightness in her voice cracked. Daniel handed her the envelope. She took it because her hands took it before her mind could refuse. She opened it. And the lobby of Harlan and Crest, that cold marble room built to make people feel small, became very quiet. The first page was the prenuptial agreement, her own signature at the bottom, dated 11 years ago. She stared at it, and Daniel watched the memory surface, watched her recall a Thursday afternoon, and a document she'd laughed at, and he watched her understand, all at once, what that laughter had cost her. "This is old," she said. "This doesn't. This is from before. This isn't valid." "It's entirely valid," Arthur said gently. "Witnessed, notarized, both parties independently advised. You were offered your own counsel. You declined in writing. It's on page 4. She turned to the second page. The deed. Her home. Her $1.4 million home, titled to Daniel Whitmore, purchased 3 months before their wedding, listed as separate property in the very agreement she had just been holding. The house had never been hers, not a beam of it, not a nail. And then she turned to the third page. "I watched a great many people receive difficult news over the years, and there is a particular silence that comes when a person's entire model of the world dissolves in a single instant. That is the silence that filled Vanessa Whitmore as she read the summary of her husband's net worth. Her eyes moved across the figure and then moved back as if the number might rearrange itself into something she could survive. Richard, reading over her shoulder, made a small sound, and it was not the sound of a man in love. It was the sound of a man recalculating. "That's," Vanessa began. "That's not. That can't be right." "It's certified as of this morning," Daniel said. "You wanted a full accounting of everything I was hiding. There it is. I wasn't hiding it, Vanessa. I just never told you, because I wanted to be loved for something other than that number. I dressed plainly, and I drove an old car, and I carried this bag you always hated, because my father died rich and unloved, and I swore I'd never be him. I wanted a wife who married me, for me." He paused. "I found out this morning what I actually married. You lied to me," Vanessa said, and it came out as an accusation, as though she were the one wronged. "You made me think. You made me feel poor. You let me believe." "I let you believe I was an ordinary man," Daniel said, "and in 11 years, you never once decided that ordinary was enough. That's not something I did to you. That's something you did." Miss Prentice cleared her throat. She was, whatever else she was, a competent lawyer, and she could read a balance sheet, and she could read a room. "Mr. Beale," she said, "perhaps we should speak privately for a moment." "Of course," Arthur said. "But you should know your client has already stated her position on the record, in this lobby, in front of witnesses, including her characterization of your firm's strategy and her intentions regarding a therapist's testimony." He let that sit. "My client did not come here to fights, Miss Prentice. He came here to be handed papers. Given what he has now learned, he'll be filing his own. And here, Vanessa did the thing that people in her position almost always do, the thing that revealed her most completely. She turned to Richard. She reached for his arm. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them we're—" She stopped because Richard had taken half a step back, a small step, the kind of step a man takes when he is beginning to leave a building. "You said the house alone," Richard said quietly. "You said the house and support. You said it was a sure thing." "It is," she said it. Richard. But Richard was already looking at his watch, that expensive watch, and Daniel understood that whatever had drawn this man to his wife, it had not been her. It had been the picture she had painted, the wronged wife of a passive fool, the imminent $1.4 million house, the easy half of hidden money. And now the picture was gone, and standing in its place was a woman who had signed away her claims a decade ago and had just confessed her strategy in a marble lobby. Richard did not love her. Richard had been investing, and the investment had just been revealed as worthless. Let me be clear about the resolution, because I want you to see how it landed, and I want you to see that Daniel Whitmore never once became cruel, because that mattered to him more than winning. Over the following weeks, the divorce proceeded, and it proceeded quickly, because there was almost nothing to argue about. The prenuptial agreement held exactly as it was written to hold. The house remained Daniel's. The business remained Daniel's. Vanessa's lawyer, having heard her client characterize a therapist as someone who would say what she needed her to say, quietly advised her against any strategy involving that therapist and against any claim of abuse, and against, frankly, most of what she had walked in believing. Vanessa received what the agreement she signed provided, which was a modest, fair settlement, enough to live comfortably, but nothing resembling half of 8 figures, nothing resembling the house, nothing resembling the ruin she had planned to visit on him. And here is the part I find most telling. Daniel could have fought even that. Arthur told him, plainly, that he could contest the modest settlement and reduce it further. Daniel declined. He instructed Arthur to be generous within the bounds of the agreement. When Arthur asked why, Daniel said, "Because I loved her once, and I won't let what she tried to do turn me into what my father was." Justice is her losing what she never had a right to. Cruelty would be taking what she does. I'm not interested in cruelty. Richard, for the record, was gone within the week. The last Vanessa saw of him was a text message, which perhaps she deserved and perhaps no one deserves, informing her that things had gotten complicated and that he wished her the best. As for Daniel, he did not gloat. He did not tell their mutual friends the story. He simply moved on, and something in him loosened. He stopped hiding the firm. He kept the old satchel because he had grown fond of it, but he stopped pretending to be less than he was. He had learned the lesson his father's lonely funeral had taught him, but wrongly, and now he understood it correctly. The problem had never been that money attracts the wrong people. The problem was building a marriage on a test his wife could never pass, because she never knew she was taking it. Honesty, he understood at last, was not the enemy of being loved for yourself. Honesty was the only ground on which real love could stand. He sat in his kitchen a few months later, in the house that had always been his, and he thought about the moment in that lobby when Vanessa had said, "He does not fight." She had been right about that for 11 years. What she had never understood was that a man who does not fight is not the same as a man who cannot. Daniel had never needed to fight because he had never needed to prove anything to anyone. He had let people underestimate him his whole life, and it had cost him a marriage. But it had also, in the end, shown him precisely who his wife was before she could take everything he'd built. So here's what I keep coming back to, and I want to hear what you think in the comments. Daniel spent 11 years believing that if he hid his success, he would find out whether he was truly loved. And he did find out, though not in the way he hoped. The truth is that the disguise itself was a kind of dishonesty, And dishonesty, however noble its intention, tends to draw people who are comfortable with the dark. The lesson isn't that you should never trust. It's that the people worth keeping are the ones who treat you with the same respect, whether you carry a battered old bag or a fortune, whether they think you make $90,000 a year or 80 million. Character is how someone treats the version of you they believe has nothing to offer. Vanessa believed her husband would never know what hit him. In the end, she was the one who never saw it coming, because she had spent 11 years so certain of his smallness that she never bothered to look inside the bag. If this story moved you, do me a favor and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Daniel's chair, standing behind that column, hearing all of it. Would you have walked out, or would you have handed her the envelope too? Give this video a like if you believe. Quiet dignity beats loud arrogance every single time. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Until next time, remember, the people who underestimate you are showing you exactly who they are. Believe them the first time.